Hi everyone. While our team takes a few weeks off this August, we're revisiting some of the episodes from our recent archive. And this week we're returning to a personal favourite of mine, a fascinating exploration of what happens inside the brain when everything just seems to click. That magical state where ideas seem to unfold effortlessly. Creative flow. I'm Gemma Ware, and this is The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. Have you ever experienced creative flow?
Yes, sometimes while writing. There are times when I sit down to write something and it's a struggle. I put a sentence down, I put another sentence down, I don't like it. What's the next sentence? I don't know. And other times, if I'm just in the right frame of mind, I can just sit down and write something that is virtually a final product without hardly stopping at all. But yes, I do occasionally experience flow. I'd like to experience a lot more of it. I think most people would.
This is John Kounios. He's a professor of psychological and brain sciences at Drexel University in Philadelphia in the US, and he researches the neuroscience of creativity. Recently, he's been studying the mental state, creative flow. And what's it feel like? How would you describe the feeling?
Flow has been described as effortless attention. It is total focus and absorption on a task. It's pleasurable. There's no distraction. It's just the ideas just flow. You might experience it while gardening, while cooking, while conversing, while playing music, while writing. You may have had problems that you're trying to resolve. And then one time you just sit down and all the answers just come out.
John is fascinated about what's actually going on in our brains when this happens, and he's been analysing the brains of jazz musicians to find out. So this week, we're delving into the brain with him to reveal the secrets to creative flow. Hi, Kate.
Hi, Gemma.
Great to have you on the show. So, Kate Kilpatrick, you're the Philadelphia editor at The Conversation in the US, and you recently worked with John Kounios, who we've just been hearing from, about some new research that he's been doing on the way creative flow works in our brain. What about creative flow got you interested?
I think a lot of creative people have been fascinated by this idea of creative flow and how do we sort of maximize productivity and get out our, most of creative material. And so I think just seeing something that is okay, here's a science-based look at how this works or how we might achieve flow.
And what led you to John?
As the Philadelphia editor, I'm constantly looking for Philadelphia-based scholars, people who are doing research involving Philadelphians. So I found his piece because his research was working with 32 Philly-based jazz musicians.
And Philadelphia known for its jazz?
Philadelphia has always been known for its music back since the days of Philadelphia Sound. I am not a jazz aficionado, but I do know Philly has always produced great music.
Oh, yeah. And for flow itself, have you ever experienced creative flow? I know you say you're interested in it, but have you ever experienced it yourself?
Before working with John, I would have said yes, absolutely. And after kind of understanding a little bit more about what's required and sort of the level of expertise, I'm not sure. When I think about times I've been in creative flow, it's typically either two things. So I think of either when I'm really deep in an edit and 2 hours flies by and I'm just kind of running through and everything seems to be fitting in place. And then I dance a lot. I've started dancing 2 years ago, salsa, bachata, partner dancing. In class is when I'm focused on okay, are my wrists down? Is my frame in place? Are my hips moving the right way? And then you get to the dance at, nighttime, outdoor dance under the stars, and you kind of just let all that go. But then after reading his piece, I'm like, wow, I'm very new at dance. So maybe what felt like flow is not actually flow because I definitely have not reached that level of expertise.
Well, if it felt fun, that's great.
But I
good.
felt it.
Yeah.
Whether it was happening in my brain or not, who knows?
Yeah.
But I felt it in my body.
Oh, well, thanks very much, Kate.
Absolutely. Thank you.
There are a lot of theories about how creative flow is generated in the brain. So I asked John what the research actually tells us.
So there's been behavioral psychological research about flow for more than 50 years, pioneered by the psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who popularized the term flow. But because that research focused almost entirely on overt behavior and people's introspections and their self-reports, it didn't give a really clear understanding of what the mechanisms of flow are, the internal mechanisms. It gave a good description of what it feels like, give a good description of when it tends to occur or for whom it tends to occur, but not a lot of insight into what's actually happening in the brain.
The development of new brain imaging techniques in recent decades has allowed researchers to study how creative flow works in the brain.
But a lot of those studies have had methodological problems. They haven't really isolated the flow states.
So John designed a new experiment.
What we did is to actually have people report, are you in a state of flow or not? And we use that to identify brain processes that are associated with flow.
And to do this, they used jazz musicians. Why jazz?
In recent years, jazz, improvisation, has become a favorite tool of researchers who are focused on creativity. And the reason is that in jazz improvisation, your production of ideas occurs in real time. You have to come up with new ideas constantly. You can record the musicians. You can quantify what they're doing moment by moment. And you can have experts rate the creativity of different improvisations. If you're a musician improvising jazz, you can't go back and change what you just did. So you can study literally the flow of ideas in real time. One could do the same thing with, for example, Indian classical music, which is, again, improvisatory and can be recorded, it can be analyzed. If we were in India, we probably would have used Indian classical musicians.
Yeah, I'd just rather be alone.
At least one or two studies have looked at rap musicians who are improvising. You can do this with anything in which people improvise. And jazz was just a very good tool or vehicle for that.
And you're in Philadelphia, so you asked a bunch of jazz guitarists from Philadelphia to come into your lab. What did you ask them to do?
The pitch, of course, was to get them into the lab so that we could reveal to them and to ourselves what's going on in their brains when they actually improvise. And so we used musicians that had a range of experience. Some were highly experienced, real experts, people who had been performing hundreds of performances over many decades. And we also had some musicians who were very good and had given some performances, but very few. They were relative novices. What we asked them to do is to improvise to lead sheets that had chord sequences and a rhythm that we provided that was playing in the background. And they improvised to several of these, each musician, and we asked them to rate the degree of flow they experienced during each of these improvisations.
The music you're hearing here is actually some of the recordings made during the experiments.
We recorded all of these improvisations, and then we had 3 expert judges, people who were teaching jazz in musical conservatories, expert teachers, rate these recorded performances along various dimensions, but also including for creativity. And while the musicians were performing, we recorded their EEGs, their electroencephalograms, which give a record of the electrical activity of the brain moment by moment. And then we could isolate the performances during which there was high flow compared to performances during which there was low flow.
After John's team of experts rated the musicians' performances, they found significant differences between the abilities of the professional musicians and the hobbyists. And there were also differences in how often they experienced creative flow.
The most experienced musicians, their creativity ratings of their performances were higher than the less experienced musicians, but also they reported being in a flow state more often than the less experienced musicians. So right there, that suggests that there's something about experience, something about expertise that allows one to get into a flow state. You can't just tackle some new task or a task that you're not very familiar with or not very expert in and immediately go into a flow state. It has to be something that you've already learned and practiced for quite some time, to the point where with the expert musicians, they just felt like they're just turning a faucet on and letting it all come out. Whereas the more inexperienced musicians, they tend to think through it in a very deliberate way. Oh, now I'll try this. Oh, that didn't work very well. Now I'll try that. Ah, that worked well. I'll do more of that. Now I have to switch to something else. Whereas the jazz musicians, they're not thinking about it. It's just coming out.
As a kind of amateur jazz saxophonist myself, a lapsed one, I should say, I totally get what you're saying there. You really have to think about, oh, there's this chord, it's coming up. What am I going to do? Oh, that bit worked. What did you then learn when you went back and analysed the brain scans of the musicians?
So one thing that jumped out was that the most experienced musicians had a network of brain areas in the left hemisphere that was associated with a high state of flow. And we did not see that in the less experienced musicians. So that suggested right there that experience allowed these high-performing musicians. It led to the development of a specialized brain network for jazz improvisation, specialized area that built up over many years of performing and practicing.
Scientists have identified specific functions performed by both the left and right sides of the brain, but it's not been very clear where creativity fits in. So the fact that this expert network that John had found was in the left side of the brain is important.
There is a theory, it goes back to the 1990s. Elkonin Goldberg, a neuropsychologist, proposed this theory, that the two hemispheres of the brain play different roles in cognition and in creativity. So when you're learning something new, the right hemisphere is primarily involved. When you become very practiced at it, then that skill shifts over to the left hemisphere. These left hemisphere areas are areas that are known to be involved in hearing, in motor control, things like that. So they're things that are at face value make sense for someone who's playing the guitar and listening to the rhythms, listening to themselves, etc. So this is consistent with that theory. That kind of baked-in creativity becomes automatic with a lot of practice. That's a left hemisphere capability. The most experienced musicians, they have built up this network. They can produce high-quality improvisations on demand.
Neuroscientists have also distinguished a second type of creativity.
Some researchers who study intelligence call this fluid intelligence. It's the ability to deal with novelty, with unfamiliarity. And according to Goldberg's idea, that the right hemisphere seems to be more involved in fluid intelligence. So these less experienced musicians, they're thinking it through. This is all new to them. They're not familiar with as many types of rhythms and chord sequences. They're less practiced, so they have to engage the right hemisphere.
What was exciting about John's study was what his brain scans revealed about the level of control the musicians seemed to be exerting when they experienced creative flow. Now, our ability to control our cognitive functions is mostly associated with a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, or the frontal lobes. It crosses over both hemispheres of the brain, and it helps with things like planning and organising tasks, decision-making, or identifying problems and figuring out solutions.
Our data supported another theory or hypothesis about flow, and that involves what's called transient hypofrontality. So there's a theory that was proposed about 20 years ago by a cognitive neuroscientist named Arne Dietrich. And he argued that flow involves a release of control, a release of cognitive control. So our results fit this idea perfectly.
So could you actually see in your brain scans that the more experienced musicians were letting go of control? Was there an area of the brain that kind of deactivated?
Yes. The frontal lobes of the brain, or part of the frontal lobes of the brain, the superior frontal gyri, were deactivated when the expert musicians were in a high flow state. That was coupled with greater activity in this left hemisphere expert network. So with years of practice, these experienced musicians have built up this specialized network that allow them to just generate these musical ideas and perform them. But They have to release control in order to let that brain network take over. So you might think of this as analogous to, say, a world-class tennis player who all of a sudden has a dry streak and is losing some games, making some mistakes. And there are two ways to go about this, right? So if that tennis player has a coach that says, okay, you're doing this wrong, you're making mistakes because maybe you have to lift your elbow a little more and maybe you got to pay attention more to where your body's pointed and all that, that can lead to more problems because the person is exerting cognitive control. They're paying too much attention to what they're doing and they're choking because they're not letting their expertise take over. They're not letting this expert brain network take over. What they should really be doing is just ignoring that. Don't pay too much attention to what they're doing and just let the dry streak just run out. And it could just be random chance anyway. And let their expertise take over. And choking by paying too much attention to yourself and exerting too much control or micromanaging yourself, that is what blocks this flow network from taking over and generating ideas on demand.
If we want to release control over our frontal lobes, it's not as easy as simply consciously flicking a switch to deactivate that region of our brain and get more creative.
If you simply tell people, okay, now that was good, but now be more creative, they are for a little while. And that you find this in many domains, in music, in writing, in design, invention, in all kinds of things. However, expertise, experience is really important to creativity.
John did another study a few years ago, again with experienced and non-experienced musicians, to see what would happen if they were told, be more creative.
What we found was that for the least experienced musicians, when you tell them to be more creative, they produce musical improvisations that are rated to be of higher creativity. But if you tell that to the most experienced musicians, they get irritable. What do you mean be more creative? I'm always creative. What do you mean? They don't get any better. And in fact, some of them get even a little bit worse because they've been doing it for so long that the creativity, it's baked in, it's automatic. Whereas the less experienced musicians who haven't been doing it for that long, they're still using cognitive control to perform. So if you ask them to adjust what they're doing, it's not a problem because they're controlling consciously what they're doing anyway. They just decide, okay, I'll do this a little bit different. So it helps to tell people to be more creative, but that is for situations in which the person's not already an expert because you don't want them to micromanage themselves and choke.
What purpose does creative flow then have? Are there any evolutionary kind of markers about why we might be able to achieve this state in something that we're an expert in?
So a former student of mine who's now a professor at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, David Melnikoff, has proposed that flow does have an evolutionary basis. And the idea is that flow is pleasurable. People love to be in a state of flow. They'll seek it out. And he argues flow provides neural rewards. It activates the reward system of the brain in order to encourage people or reward people for doing things that they're successful at, that are working well. So instead of so-called beating a dead horse by trying constantly to do things that one is not good at, you get rewarded for doing things that you are good at, that you've practiced, and that is why people seek out flow. And it makes sense. It doesn't explain necessarily why people will work hard to practice at something and become an expert at it in the beginning, because in the beginning, it's very tedious to acquire that expertise. Learning to play a musical instrument at a high level takes years and lots of practice. But once you're good at something, you want to do it more and more and more because it just feels good.
And other than those years and years of practice, are there any other ways people try successfully to reach a state of creative flow?
If our results are pointing us in the right direction, and if you need both the expertise and the release of conscious control, then flow is not something you can just turn on. You have to have that expertise. You have to put in the work initially. But then once you put in the work, you have to do things to release cognitive control. Some musicians may use alcohol. They may use drugs in order to release cognitive control. I'm not recommending that for anyone, and it shouldn't be necessary to do that. There are plenty of informal techniques. I'm not aware of any scientifically validated techniques for doing this, although I don't see why they couldn't be developed. But sure, anything that will get you to, once you've achieved expertise, to not focus so much on what you're doing and to just let your expertise take over, that should work. Don't overthink it. Just do it. Just let go.
Thank you so much, John. It's been fascinating talking with you. It makes me want to go practice my saxophone, so maybe I'll get it out this evening.
Good idea. Thank you very much.
That's it for this week's episode. We'll pop a link in our show notes to a story that John Kounias wrote for The Conversation about his new study. This episode was written and produced by Mend Mariwany, with assistance from Katie Flood. Sound design was by Eloise Stevens, and our theme music is by Nita Saal. Stephen Kahn is our global executive editor, and Sarai Nandi does our transcripts. I'm Gemma Ware, the show's executive producer. You can connect with us on Instagram at theconversation.com or email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. Do sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. And if you like what we do, please support our podcast and The Conversation more broadly by going to donate.theconversation.com. Please do also rate and review the show on whatever platform you listen to. It really helps us reach a wider audience. Thanks very much.